Shalom everybody, hope you're doing well, hope you had a great week, getting ready for another Shabbat in the world. Parshat, Chayyei, the life of Sarah. An ironic name because we learned at the very, very opening of this week's Torah portion that Sarah has died. And many commentaries speak about this very, very first verse of the Torah, which basically, first verse of the Parsha, which speaks about Sarah's life and mentioned that she lived 127 years, but based on the wording of the verse, they extract and teach many different things. Rashi specifically teaches on this first verse that he asks the question, why was the story of the Kirat Yitzchak, the binding of Isaac, of Yitzchak, bringing him up to the mountain, almost being slaughtered by his father to being brought as a sacrifice to God, why is that whole story right next to, in the Torah, the story or the telling of Sarah's death? And Rashi answers by saying that when Sarah just heard of the story, when she was hearing the story of what happened to her son, it was so overwhelming, it was so intense that her soul flew out of her body. It was too much for her. It was so overwhelming. She just died on the spot. And based on that, again, many commentators speak about what's this about, why did she die? The Or HaChaim speaks at the beginning of the Parsha that this basically tells us that Sarah was supposed to live longer. She lived 127 years, but she was supposed to live longer, but just this hearing of the story was, again, so overwhelming for her, she died early. Right? Her life was cut short. So what's going on here? The Warsaw Ghetto Rebbe, the Eish Kodesh, in his famous work, Eish Kodesh, which he wrote while he was in the Warsaw Ghetto during the Shoah, during the Holocaust. Right? Those intense years, you can imagine the darkness that was in the war that he was feeling and seeing around him every single day. Yet he still wrote beautiful words of Torah based on the Torah portion. And we have these words, Baruch Hashem, with us today. He quotes the Rimon of a Rebbe, who quotes the Gemara, that says that there's a connection between melach, salt, and suffering. That just like melach is mitakein the basar, it fixes the meat, enables someone to eat the meat, right, by sucking all the blood out of it. Right, it kind of sweetens the meat. So too suffering. That suffering, just like salt, has a purpose in the world. Right? And that suffering, basically, it fixes the soul. Right? Depending on someone's hashkafa, their outlook on life, they might look at certain things, especially suffering, as totally random. Why is this happening to me? But we learn the Torah says it over and over and over again, especially in Chassidut and Kabbalah, that everything happens in this world is for a reason, even the hard stuff. Right? Even the suffering. So, the Warsaw Rebbe goes on to basically teach us, right, that suffering, just like with salt, it has to happen in the right measure. If you use too much salt in the salting process, the basar, the meat, is ruined. It's not good. It's not sweet, so to speak, anymore. So too is suffering. Suffering happens in measure. It happens in a certain measure. And when it happens in the right measure, it fulfills its purpose. It serves its purpose. It does its work. But if there's too much suffering, right, the whole thing's broken, the whole thing's off. Right? Nothing really gets accomplished. Where do we learn that from? From Sarah. Right? We're learning this idea from Sarah. Sarah, on some level, Sarah's like this strong leader of the Jewish people, of the beginning of the Jewish people. Her and Avram together are changing the whole world. And yet she hears one story about her son, and of course it's an intense story, but she dies right on the spot. She didn't have the strength to hear the story. So, on some level, and what the Warsaw Ghetto Rebbe, right, continues to teach us, is that this death of Sarah dying upon hearing this story, she was doing a tovah to all of Am Yisrael. She was doing a favor, doing a good deed, something good for all of the Jewish people, for all the generations up until ours. What does he mean by that? He explains that Sarah took to heart so deeply, this story. It was mamash like suffering to her, just to hear what happened. It was so intense for her that she dies. She takes it to heart so intensely to show God, to show Hashem, to teach Hashem, so to speak. Look, there's such a thing in this world, there's too much suffering. There's suffering, yes, it has a place, it fulfills a role, it has its task to fulfill, but there's such a thing as too much suffering. There's such a thing as too much suffering in this world. I want you to know that. And Sarah Imenu, right, teaches that lesson to God, so to speak, right, for the good of all the Jewish people in all the generations, right? On some level we can understand, we would imagine that she would be strong enough to hear the story again, right? But on some level she's taking it to heart so deeply, right, to bring that idea into the world, right, that please, yes, suffering, but not too much. Not too much, right? And just a closing thought, I'm thinking that if this is the way that Sarah chooses, so to speak, to leave this world, right, it's really a reflection on how she lived her entire life in this world, right? If this is how her whole life comes to an end, it's really teaching us even deeper how she lived her entire life. At the end of her life, she's taking something so deeply to heart, so intensely that it causes her to leave this world. Her soul just leave her body, right? But all 127 years that she lived in this world, she took everything so deeply to heart, right? What was happening in the world, seeing the confusion, the spiritual confusion, the spiritual darkness that was around her in her life, she takes so to heart that it motivates her to do the work that she does. She's a very holy woman, right? The Torah teaches us she's even a higher prophet than Avram, her husband, right? And this idea of taking something to heart, I think, is a lesson that we could extract very importantly from this week's Torah portion from Sarah, right? From the first matriarch of the Jewish people, and on some level the entire world. Right? How do we live our lives? We should take things so deeply to heart, right? Not just the suffering, right, but everything, right? And not just the physical suffering, but we see something in the world that bothers us. We've said this before. Let it bother us. It should bother us, right? When it bothers us, we know that we're alive. When we see something wrong in the world, when we see something that's dark, when we see something that's off, and that seeing is showing us that we're really living, right? Something that we learn about Sarah from this first verse as well is that she lived life so to the fullest. Every single moment she was constantly clinging to God, constantly in the zone, so to speak, and with the spiritual awareness and focus. And she's teaching us how we can live our lives as well, right? Her death teaches us about her life, right? And all that teaches us how we can live our lives, right? So yearning for closeness with our Creator, yearning for closeness with the people around us, yearning for a better world, seeing the things that are off in this world, letting it bother us, not to a paralyzing level, but to a motivating level, right? So that we could, God willing, right, do something in this world, do our part, play our role in the story of humanity, of creation, right, to make this world an even sweeter place, an even better place. B'ezrat Hashem, we should see this week the world getting even better, motivated by the light of Shabbat that's coming to this world so soon. Sending love and blessings from the land of Israel. Shabbat Shalom, Shabbat Shalom.